The words slipped through the stone corridor like poison wrapped in velvet, and Grace Owens pressed herself against the cold wall, heart hammering so hard she was certain it would betray her presence. I would burn this entire world to ash before I let anyone harm her. The Vampire King's voice was barely a whisper, raw and desperate in a way that contradicted everything she'd been told about him. Grace had only meant to find a bathroom in this labyrinthine mansion, having gotten hopelessly lost after the diplomatic reception ended. She'd taken a wrong turn somewhere past the gallery of oil paintings, each one depicting pale, regal figures with eyes that seemed to follow her movement. Now she found herself frozen in a shadowed alcove, listening to words that made her blood run cold and hot simultaneously. "Your Majesty, the Council will never approve," another voice responded, older, weary. "She is human. The laws are ancient and unbreakable. If they discover what she means to you, then I will rewrite every law that stands between us." There was steel in those words now, the kind of absolute certainty that came from centuries of command. "Do you think I survived 4,000 years by bowing to limitations?" Grace's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. 4,000 years. The number alone made her dizzy. She'd known Valdimir Thorne was old. All vampires were but 4 millennia. The man who'd watched her across the reception hall with those intense silver eyes, who'd spoken to her about modern art and asked about her work at the museum with what seemed like genuine interest, had walked the earth since before the pyramids were ancient. "My king, I only urge caution. If the Blood Council learns you've formed an attachment to a mortal, they will see it as weakness. There are already whispers, those who question whether you've grown too soft for these modern times. They remember the purges, the wars. They expect strength, not love." Valdimir's laugh was bitter, hollow. "I have given them 4,000 years of strength, Casimir. 4,000 years of conquest in blood and absolute dominion. I have crushed rebellions, negotiated treaties, transformed our kind from hunted monsters into the hidden rulers of this world. And in all those centuries, in all those endless nights, I have felt nothing. Nothing, do you understand? I have walked through empires and watched them crumble to dust. I have seen beauty that would break mortal minds and felt only emptiness. Until her." Grace felt tears prick her eyes, though she couldn't explain why. The raw vulnerability in his voice struck something deep inside her, some lonely part of her soul that recognized itself in his words. She laughed tonight," Valdimir continued, softer now, "at something foolish the ambassador's aide said. And the sound of it, Casimir, it was like hearing music for the first time after centuries of silence. She doesn't know what she is, what she's done to me. She cannot know. I won't allow her to be drawn into our darkness, won't let her become a target for my enemies. Tomorrow, when the conference ends, she will return to her ordinary life. She will forget she ever met me, and I will endure another eternity of emptiness. But she will be safe. Then why not simply compel her to forget tonight? Your powers—" "No," the word cracked like a whip. "I will not violate her mind. I will not take her choices from her. If I cannot have her honestly, then I will have nothing. Let me keep these 3 days as a memory. Let me have stolen enough glances to last another 4,000 years. Grace's vision blurred with tears. She needed to leave, to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. Her mind spun with impossible revelations. She'd come to Prague for a conference on medieval artifacts, her first international assignment since joining the Metropolitan Museum's research division. The reception at Thorne Manor had been an unexpected honor. The reclusive billionaire collector rarely opened his doors to anyone. She'd assumed it was about the exhibition her department was planning. She'd never imagined this, any of this. The conversation beyond the alcove shifted to logistical matters, security arrangements, council politics, things Grace barely processed through her shock. She used the distraction to slip backward, her soft-soled shoes silent on the marble floor. She retraced her path with painful slowness, terrified every breath would echo, every heartbeat would somehow reach vampire ears. She didn't breathe properly until she was back in the civilized part of the mansion where human staff still moved about, clearing glasses and extinguishing candles. She retrieved her coat with shaking hands, mumbled something about feeling unwell to the concerned attendant, and escaped into the cold Prague night. The hotel was only 3 blocks away, but Grace barely registered the walk. Her mind replayed every word, every nuance of that overheard confession. The Vampire King loved her. The most powerful immortal creature in existence, a being who'd shaped human history from the shadows, had fallen in love with her. Grace Owens, 26-year-old art historian with student loans and a tiny apartment in Queens. It was insane, impossible, and yet her heart raced with something that wasn't entirely fear. She'd noticed him immediately at the reception, of course. Everyone had. Valdimir Thorne commanded attention, the way gravity commanded obedience, absolute and unavoidable. He stood well over 6 feet with the kind of aristocratic bearing that made expensive suits look like royal robes. His hair was pure white, worn long enough to brush his shoulders, framing a face of such severe classical beauty it might have been carved from marble by a master sculptor. But it was his eyes that had captured her, silver like moonlight on snow, ancient and knowing and infinitely sad. He'd approached her near the Caravaggio, one of dozens of priceless works that lined his private gallery, as casually as someone else might display family photos. "You were staring at it with such intensity," he had said, his voice carrying the faintest accent she couldn't place, something that suggested he'd learned English long before it became recognizable as modern English. "Either you're an art historian or a very dedicated thief casing the security." Grace had laughed, startled into genuine amusement. "Art historian? Though I'd be a terrible thief, I can barely lie about liking someone's haircut." His smile had transformed his face, softening the harsh beauty into something warm and almost human. Honesty. How refreshing. In my experience, humans lie as naturally as they breathe. "Then you've been meeting the wrong humans." "Perhaps I have?" They'd talked for an hour, drifting through the gallery as other guests gave them wide berth. Grace had been too absorbed to notice how people watched them, the shocked whispers that followed their movement. She'd only registered intelligent conversation about art and history, the surprising gentleness with which he handled a 15th-century manuscript when showing her his collection, the way his eyes seemed to memorize her face when he thought she wasn't looking. Now, lying in her hotel bed and staring at the ceiling, Grace understood what those whispered words meant. He'd known even then that he was saying goodbye. Every moment had been deliberate, a memory he was carefully constructing to sustain him through eternity. The thought broke her heart. She should be terrified. She should pack her bags and flee back to New York, forget this entire insane situation. Vampires were dangerous, everyone knew that. The supernatural world lived alongside humanity in an uneasy truce, maintained by strict laws and stricter boundaries. Vampires kept to their world, humans to theirs, and the few interactions that occurred were formal, distant, carefully regulated. Falling in love across that divide wasn't just forbidden, it was unthinkable. But Grace had always been too curious for her own good, too willing to question why things were the way they were. And lying there in the dark, she couldn't stop remembering the anguish in Valdimir's voice, the terrible loneliness of someone who'd lived 40 centuries without feeling anything. She made a decision that was probably the worst of her life. Morning came with gray autumn light filtering through thin curtains. Grace dressed carefully in her most professional outfit, a charcoal dress with a fitted blazer, her dark blonde hair pulled into a neat bun. She needed armor for what she was about to do. The conference had one final day of presentations, but Grace skipped them all. Instead, she stood outside the towering iron gates of Thorne Manor, pressing the intercom button before she could lose her nerve. "Deliveries to the service entrance," a crisp voice responded. "I'm not a delivery. My name is Grace Owens. I need to speak with Mr. Thorne. It's urgent." A long pause. Then, "Miss Owens, the master is not receiving visitors today. If you'd like to leave a message, tell him I heard him last night. Tell him I know what he said in the East Corridor, and I'm not leaving until he speaks with me." The intercom went silent. Grace wrapped her coat tighter against the wind, wondering if she'd just made a catastrophic mistake. Minutes stretched into a quarter hour. She was seriously considering the wisdom of her choices when the gate shuddered and began to open. A man stood in the courtyard beyond Vampire, obviously, with that telltale porcelain skin and otherworldly stillness. He was ancient too, his white hair bound in a low tail, his expression severe beneath dark brows. "Miss Owens, I am Casimir, the king's chamberlain. You will come with me." His tone suggested this wasn't an invitation. Grace followed him through immaculate gardens gone dormant for winter, past fountains depicting creatures from mythology, up marble steps into the mansion proper. The route took them through different corridors than last night, deeper into the private quarters. They passed vampires who stopped and stared with open shock at the human being led through their domain. Grace kept her chin up, refusing to show fear even as her heart tried to pound out of her chest. Finally, Casimir opened a heavy oak door and gestured her inside. "The king will join you momentarily. I suggest you consider your words very carefully, Miss Owens. You are playing with forces you do not understand." Then he left her alone in what appeared to be a study. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled with volumes in dozens of languages, some with spines so ancient the titles had faded beyond recognition. A massive desk dominated one corner, its surface scattered with papers covered in elegant handwriting. Artifacts filled every available surface: a Roman gladius, an Egyptian ankh, a jade dragon that might have been Chinese, pieces of history casually displayed like souvenirs. "You should not have come here." Grace spun around. Valdimir stood in the doorway, and in the daylight filtering through heavy curtains, he was even more striking than memory suggested. He wore all black tailored pants, a silk shirt open at the collar, and his silver eyes burned with an intensity that made her breath catch. But underneath the commanding presence she saw strain, exhaustion, barely leashed emotion. "You heard me," he continued, closing the door with careful control. "Last night, you were there. I got lost looking for a bathroom. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but you heard words meant only for my most trusted advisor, words that put you in considerable danger." He crossed the room with inhuman speed, suddenly close enough that she could see flecks of darker gray in his silver irises, could feel the cold that radiated from his body like winter made manifest. "Do you understand what you've learned, Grace? Do you comprehend what it means?" She refused to back away, tilting her head to meet his eyes. "It means the Vampire King has feelings for me. Feelings he planned to hide and never act on because he's afraid I'll be hurt." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, at her directness. Not afraid. Certain. The vampire world is built on power and blood and ancient cruelties. There are those who would see you as my weakness, a vulnerability to exploit. There are laws written in blood that forbid unions between vampire nobility and humans. And beyond the political nightmare, there is the simple fact that I am a monster, Grace. I have killed more people than you could count in 10 lifetimes. I have committed atrocities that would shatter your mind to witness. You are light and warmth and humanity, and I would corrupt all of that simply by touching it. "That's a lovely speech," Grace said, amazed her voice remained steady. "Very noble and self-sacrificing, but you don't get to make that choice for me." Valdimir laughed, a sharp, almost desperate sound. "You're mortal. You live in sunlight and safety, going to museums and meeting friends for coffee, enjoying an ordinary, beautiful life. I would steal all of that from you. I would drag you into darkness and danger and a world where casual cruelty is considered tradition. I would watch you age while I remained unchanged, would hold you as you died, and then face eternity remembering what I'd lost. Do you think I haven't considered every possible outcome? There's no version of this that doesn't end in your suffering." "Unless you turn me," Grace said quietly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Valdimir went utterly still, every muscle locked. Never. The word was barely audible, vibrating with suppressed violence. "I will not damn you to this existence. I will not steal your humanity, your warmth, your very soul. I will not make you into what I am." "Then we have a problem," Grace said, forcing steel into her voice. "Because I didn't come here to be dismissed for my own good. I came here because last night I heard a man, yes, a vampire, but still a person express the kind of lonely desperation I recognize. I came because, in one evening of conversation, I felt more connection than I've felt in years of dating humans who only see the surface of me. I came because maybe, just maybe, this insane situation is worth exploring instead of running from." Valdimir stared at her as if she'd grown a second head. "You cannot mean this. You cannot possibly want—" "I don't know what I want," Grace interrupted. "I barely slept last night trying to process all of this, but I know I don't want you making decisions about my life without me. I know I don't want to spend the rest of my existence wondering what might have happened if I'd been brave enough to try. And I know that what I heard last night was real, probably the most real thing I've experienced in a long time." For a long moment, Valdimir simply looked at her. Then, slowly, with a grace that seemed both reverent and reluctant, he sank to his knees before her. The Vampire King knelt at her feet, his white hair falling forward to hide his face, his entire posture radiating anguish. When he spoke, his voice was raw. "Please, please, Grace, forget this. Forget me. Return to your life and find a good human man who can give you children and a house with a garden and Sunday mornings in the sun. Find someone who deserves you. I am begging you to walk away from this before I become too selfish to let you go." Grace's hands trembled as she reached down, tilting his chin up to meet her eyes. His skin was cold as marble under her fingers, and the expression on his face was devastating hope and despair warring for dominance. "I can't forget," she whispered, "and I don't think you really want me to." Something broke behind his eyes. His hand came up to cover hers where it touched his face, and his expression transformed into naked longing. "You have no idea how much I want to be selfish, how much I want to say yes to this madness. 4,000 years, and I have never wanted anything as much as I want you. Then stop protecting me from my own choices." "Grace?" A sharp knock interrupted them. Casimir's voice came through the door, tight with urgency. "Your Majesty, we have a situation. The Blood Council has called an emergency session. They're demanding your presence within the hour." Valdimir was on his feet instantly, the vulnerable man vanishing behind a mask of royal authority. "Why? What's happened?" "Word has spread about the human guest, about how you spent the reception evening in private conversation rather than attending to diplomatic obligations. There are accusations being made, sire. Serious ones." Grace felt ice flood her veins. "This is my fault. I shouldn't have come here this morning." "No." Valdimir's hand caught hers, his grip gentle but unbreakable. "This is not your fault. This is vampire politics, the eternal game of power and positioning. Someone saw an opportunity and seized it. Casimir, tell them I'll attend their session, and make it clear that any threats toward Miss Owens will be considered acts of war against the crown." "My king, such a declaration will only inflame—" "I don't care. Grace is under my protection now. Any vampire who harms her answers to me personally." Casimir's expression was grim, but he bowed. "As you command." When they were alone again, Valdimir turned to her, and Grace saw real fear in his ancient eyes for the first time. "I need to ask something of you, something you won't like." "What?" "Stay here, in the manor under guard, until I resolve this council matter. The vampires calling this session are old, powerful, and deeply traditional. If they've decided you're a threat to their ordered world, they won't hesitate to eliminate that threat. Here, surrounded by my household, you're safe." "You want me to hide?" "I want you alive." His hands framed her face, cold and gentle. "Please, Grace. Give me time to navigate this. The Blood Council has governed vampire law for 3,000 years. I can't simply overrule them without risking civil war. But I can outmaneuver them if I'm careful. Just stay here. Stay safe. Let me handle this." Every instinct screamed at Grace to argue, to insist she wouldn't be locked away like a damsel in a tower, but the genuine fear in Valdimir's expression stopped her. This wasn't about controlling her. It was about a man terrified of losing something precious. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll stay. But Valdimir, come back to me." He leaned down and pressed his forehead to hers, a gesture of such tender intimacy it made her heart ache. "I have survived 4,000 years of darkness. Now that I've found light, I'm not letting go without a fight." Then he was gone, moving with that supernatural speed, and Grace was alone in the study. Within minutes, Casimir returned with 2 female vampires, both white-haired and elegant in tailored suits. "Miss Owens, these are Seraphine and Morgana. They will see you to a guest suite and ensure your comfort and your safety." "Am I a guest or a prisoner?" Grace asked, more curious than accusatory. Casimir's lips twitched with something that might have been amusement. With vampires, the distinction is often academic. Come, I'll show you to quarters that are considerably more comfortable than a cell. The suite they led her to was stunning, all antique furniture and silk drapes, with a canopy bed that looked like it belonged in a castle, and a bathroom with a clawfoot tub large enough to swim in. French doors opened onto a balcony overlooking the gardens, though Seraphine pointedly mentioned the balcony was warded with alarms. "We're not here to imprison you," Morgana said, her accent carrying hints of something Eastern European and very old. "But the king's enemies are numerous. If they cannot strike at him directly, they will strike at what he values. Until this council session is resolved, you're safer behind these walls." "Tell me about the Blood Council," Grace said. "If I'm going to be caught up in vampire politics, I should understand them." Seraphine and Morgana exchanged glances. Finally, Seraphine spoke. "The council consists of the 12 oldest vampires in existence, excluding the king himself. They were established after the Purge Wars 3 millennia ago as a check on royal power. The king rules, but the council creates and enforces the laws that govern our kind. They are traditional, rigid, and deeply suspicious of anything that might upset the careful balance between our world and yours." "And a vampire king falling for a human would definitely upset that balance," Grace concluded. "Isha-ta-ta." "It's not just about human-vampire relations," Morgana added, settling into a chair with liquid grace. "It's about the perception of weakness. Vampire society is built on strength, on absolute certainty. Love, especially love for something as fragile and temporary as a human, is seen as a liability. There are vampires who've been waiting centuries for any sign that King Valdimir's power is waning. If they can paint him as compromised, as ruled by emotion rather than logic, they can challenge his authority. So this isn't really about me at all. I'm just a convenient excuse." "You're the catalyst," Seraphine corrected. "But yes, the true battle is about power, as it always is among our kind. The question is whether the king can navigate this without losing his throne or starting a war." Grace moved to the windows, looking out over Prague's skyline. The city sprawled below, a mix of medieval architecture and modern glass, humans and vampires living parallel lives that occasionally intersected but rarely intertwined. She thought about Valdimir facing down ancient vampires, defending a relationship that had barely begun, risking everything for someone he'd known only days. "He shouldn't have to fight this alone," she said quietly. "He isn't alone," Morgana replied. "The king has allies, vampires who've supported him through the centuries. But Miss Owens, you must understand, even if he wins this battle, there will be others. If you truly pursue this relationship, you'll be challenging thousands of years of tradition. You'll face opposition, danger, and hatred from those who see you as an abomination. The question you must ask yourself is whether what you feel is worth that price." Grace turned from the window. "I've known him 3 days. I can't claim to be in love, but I've spent my whole life playing it safe, following the rules, taking the sensible path. And I've been lonely in ways I didn't even recognize until last night when I heard someone express that same loneliness. Maybe this is insane. Maybe it's doomed. But for once in my life, I want to try something just because it feels right. Consequences be damned." Seraphine smiled, a genuine expression that softened her ethereal features. "Then you might just be worthy of him after all." Hours crawled past. Grace tried to read, to distract herself with the extensive library in her suite, but concentration proved impossible. She paced, watched the sun crawl across the sky, and tried not to imagine worst-case scenarios. As afternoon faded toward evening, Casimir finally knocked. "The king has returned. He wishes to see you in the great hall." Grace followed him through the mansion, her heart hammering. The great hall was a massive space that looked like it had been transplanted from a medieval castle, soaring ceilings, supported by stone columns, tapestries depicting ancient battles, a fireplace large enough to roast an ox. Valdimir stood before that fireplace, still wearing all black, his white hair loose around his shoulders. He looked exhausted in a way she hadn't thought possible for a vampire. "Grace!" He crossed to her immediately, his hands finding hers, his silver eyes searching her face as if to reassure himself she was unharmed. "Are you well? Or were you comfortable?" I'm fine. Tell me what happened." He grimaced. "The Blood Council is displeased, but I've bought us time. I've convinced them to grant a trial period 3 months during which I've agreed to limit my contact with you while they investigate the implications of a potential royal human union. It's political theater, a way for them to save face while I figure out how to permanently neutralize their opposition." 3 months of not seeing each other? Grace's heart sank. "Not exactly." Valdimir's expression turned calculating. "The exact terms were that I would not court you openly or allow our relationship to become public knowledge within vampire society. They said nothing about private meetings, nothing about me visiting your world rather than you visiting mine. The council thinks they've checkmated me, but they've merely made the game more interesting." Despite everything, Grace found herself smiling. "You're going to rules, lawyer ancient vampire law. I didn't survive 4,000 years by accepting defeat gracefully." His thumb stroked across her knuckles, a gentle gesture at odds with the fierce determination in his eyes. "But Grace, you need to understand what accepting this means. For 3 months, we'll have to be careful, discreet. Any vampire who opposes me will be watching for evidence that I'm breaking the council's terms. And at the end of those 3 months, I'll have to present a case for why our relationship should be permitted to continue. It will be difficult, dangerous, and there are no guarantees of success. Then, we'd better make sure those 3 months count," Grace said. "We need to figure out if this connection is real or just the novelty of something forbidden." Valdimir pulled her closer until their bodies nearly touched, his cold radiating through her clothes. "It's real for me. I've had 4,000 years to experience novelty in every form imaginable. What I feel when I look at you is something entirely different." "Then show me," Grace whispered. "Show me your world, who you really are, not just the king but the person underneath. Let me show you mine. We have 3 months to figure out if this impossible thing is worth fighting for." His smile was slow, transforming his face from severe beauty to something warm and almost human. "A human woman who doesn't run screaming from the Vampire King's interest. You're either incredibly brave or magnificently foolish." "Probably both." He laughed, a genuine sound of delight, and Grace realized she wanted to spend however much time she had making him laugh like that. "Very well. 3 months of careful courtship while I systematically dismantle my opposition and prepare a case that will rewrite vampire law. This should be interesting." "When do we start?" "Tomorrow night. I'll come to you, to your world. We'll do this properly, dinners, conversations, the slow dance of 2 people learning each other. But tonight?" He hesitated, vulnerability flickering across his face. "Tonight, would you stay here? Let me show you the parts of my world that are beautiful rather than dangerous. Let me have one perfect evening before the politics and complications intrude." Grace nodded, and the relief in his expression was palpable. He kept her hand clasped in his as he led her through the mansion, narrating its history. The building had been constructed in the 15th century by a vampire noble who'd perished in the Purge Wars. Valdimir had claimed it 500 years ago, transforming it from fortress to a repository of art and history. "I've spent centuries collecting," he explained, pausing before a medieval manuscript displayed in climate-controlled glass. "At first, it was simply hoarding. Dragons aren't the only creatures that appreciate treasure. But over time, I realized I was trying to hold on to humanity, to all the beautiful, fleeting things humans create. Each piece here represents someone's life work, their passion, their brief moment of immortality." "That's why you invited the museum conference," Grace realized. "You wanted to share this." "I wanted to see it through human eyes again, to remember why these things matter." He gestured around the gallery. "Do you know what the curse of immortality truly is? Not the bloodthirst or the sunlight intolerance. It's the gradual numbing of wonder. When you've seen 1,000 sunrises, or in my case, the memory of them, they stop being miraculous. When you've heard every symphony, read every book, tasted every vintage of wine, existence becomes a catalog of repetition. Until you." He turned to face her fully, his silver eyes burning. "You made me feel wonder again. The way you looked at that Caravaggio, the passion in your voice when you explained the symbolism, the genuine joy you took in discovering something new. It reminded me what it was like to be alive, rather than simply existing. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. I'm not special, Valdimir. I'm just a woman who likes art. You're human, he said softly. Mortal and burning bright because of it. Every moment matters to you in a way I'd forgotten. And when I'm with you, I remember too. I remember that time is precious, that beauty matters, that connection is worth the risk of pain. He led her to a conservatory filled with night-blooming flowers, their perfume heavy in the air. A table had been set with human food. Someone had clearly anticipated her needs. As they sat, Grace found herself relaxing despite the strangeness of the situation. Bro, tell me about your life, Valdimir said. I want to know everything. Your childhood, your dreams, what you have for breakfast, why you chose art history, all the small details that make you who you are. So Grace told him. About growing up in Oregon with two older brothers who'd treated her like a fragile doll. About developing a love of art as a way to escape into larger worlds. About her determination to prove she could succeed in a competitive field. She talked about her tiny apartment decorated with museum prints, about Sunday brunches with her best friend Zara, about the satisfaction of piecing together the provenance of an artifact like solving a beautiful puzzle. Valdimir listened with absolute focus, asking questions, genuinely interested in the mundane details of mortal existence. In return, he shared fragments of his own history, not the grand political events, but the personal moments. The first time he'd tasted coffee in 16th century Constantinople. The wonder of hearing recorded music for the first time. The night he'd stood on a New York skyscraper and watched electric lights transform the city into a constellation. I've seen empires rise and fall, he said. I've watched humanity evolve from Bronze Age tribes to the modern world. And through it all, I've been a witness, never a participant. Never truly part of the story. I wonder sometimes if that's my real curse, to watch life without living it. Then maybe that's what I can give you, Grace said softly. Not immortality or grand purpose, but just life. Real, messy, ordinary life. His hand covered hers on the table, cold and solid. There's nothing ordinary about you. They talked until late into the night, until Grace's yawns became too frequent to hide. Valdimir insisted she take the guest suite again, promised to arrange transportation back to her hotel in the morning. He walked her to the door, hesitant to say goodnight. Thank you, he said quietly, for not running, for giving this a chance, for making me feel hope again. Grace rose on her toes and pressed a kiss to his cold cheek, feeling him go utterly still beneath the gesture. 3 months, she said. Let's make them count. His smile was soft, almost shy, nothing like the commanding king. 3 months, and then forever if I have any say in it. The next evening, Valdimir appeared at Grace's hotel precisely at sunset, dressed in modern clothes that somehow still managed to look regal. They walked through Prague's old town, talking and laughing, and Grace was struck by how normal it felt. He bought her hot chocolate from a street vendor, couldn't drink it himself, but enjoyed watching her enjoyment. They stood on the Charles Bridge as snow began to fall, fat flakes catching in his white hair, and Grace thought she'd never seen anything more beautiful. I should be working, she said, not meaning it at all. The conference technically doesn't end until tomorrow. Play hooky, Valdimir suggested. I've arranged a private viewing at the National Gallery. I know the night curator. Of course you do. They spent hours in the empty museum, Valdimir sharing stories about artists he'd known, patrons he'd watched, the real history behind famous paintings. His knowledge was encyclopedic, personal, and utterly fascinating. Grace found herself falling deeper with every word, every shared laugh, every moment of comfortable silence. Over the following weeks, they fell into a rhythm. Valdimir would appear each night at sunset. Wherever Grace happened to be, she'd return to New York after the conference, and he followed. They explored the city like tourists, visited hole-in-the-wall restaurants where he'd watch her eat and tell her stories, walked through Central Park in the snow, attended concerts where he'd quietly sing along with operas written before her country existed. He met her in her world, made himself part of her life with careful consideration for her comfort and safety. And slowly, Grace fell completely, irrevocably in love. It wasn't just his appearance, though. She couldn't deny he was beautiful. It wasn't the novelty of dating someone immortal, though that certainly added interest. It was the way he listened when she talked about her day, genuinely interested in museum politics and artifact acquisitions. It was how he'd shown up at her apartment with first editions of her favorite books, knowing they'd make her happy. It was the loneliness she recognized in him, the vulnerability he showed her when he dropped his royal mask and just existed as himself. As 2 months into their careful courtship, Grace invited him to her apartment for the first time. It was tiny, especially compared to his mansion, cluttered with books and framed prints and the comfortable chaos of an academic's life. Valdimir stood in the center of her living room, looking around with an expression of wonder. "This is perfect," he said softly. "It's so completely you." "It's a mess," Grace laughed. "It's alive, it's warm, it smells like vanilla and old books and home." He turned to her and something in his expression made her breath catch. "Grace, I need to tell you something." "That sounds ominous." "Not ominous, just, true." He crossed to her, taking her hands in his cold ones. "I'm in love with you. Completely, irrevocably in love. I have been since the moment you laughed at that reception, and every day since has only made it deeper. I know I'm supposed to be using these 3 months to build a logical case for the Blood Council, to demonstrate how our relationship serves greater political purposes, but the truth is much simpler. I love you, and I cannot imagine existence without you in it." Grace's heart felt too large for her chest. "I love you too. I tried not to, tried to be sensible and protect myself, but Valdimir, I love you so much it terrifies me." He pulled her close, and she went willingly into his cold embrace. "Say it again," he whispered against her hair. "I love you." Again. "I love you, Valdimir Thorne, Vampire King, ancient and powerful, and somehow mine." He kissed her then, and if she'd expected cold and dead, she was proven wonderfully wrong. His lips were cool but soft, moving against hers with a gentleness that contradicted every vampire stereotype. His hands cradled her face like she was something precious and breakable, and when they finally pulled apart, his silver eyes were bright with emotion. "I have waited 4,000 years for you," he said. "However long the council deliberates, whatever challenges we face, I want you to know you are worth every battle, every risk, every consequence. You are worth everything." Grace kissed him again, deeper this time, letting herself sink into the impossible reality of loving the Vampire King. They stood in her tiny apartment and held each other as snow fell outside, 2 people from different worlds choosing each other, despite every rational reason not to. The 3rd month arrived with brutal swiftness. Valdimir became tense, distracted, spending his days in Vampire Court preparing for the council's final judgment. Grace continued her work at the museum, trying to maintain normalcy while her heart existed in constant anxiety. "They're going to make me choose," Valdimir told her one night, his voice hollow. "Between you and the throne, the opposition has consolidated around that demand. Either I give you up and maintain my authority, or I abdicate, and we're free to be together. But I lose all power to protect you from those who will see you as a target." "That's not fair," Grace said, fury rising in her chest. "They have no right. They have the right granted by 3,000 years of law." He looked exhausted, ancient in a way he hadn't before. "And the worst part is, I'm considering it, giving up the throne. I've been king for so long, Grace. Perhaps it's time to let someone else carry that burden. Perhaps it's time to just live." "You love being king," Grace said softly. "Not the politics, but the ability to shape the vampire world, to keep the peace, to ensure your people thrive. I've watched you work these past months. I've seen how you care about every vampire under your protection, how you agonize over decisions that affect thousands. You were meant for this, Valdimir. I can't let you give that up for me." "Then what do you suggest?" His voice broke. "Because I cannot give you up either. I will not." Grace had been thinking about this for weeks, turning over an idea she knew was radical, possibly insane, but might be the only solution. "Turn me." Valdimir recoiled as if she'd struck him. "No, absolutely not. Listen to me. I will not damn you to this existence. I will not steal your humanity, your warmth, your mortality. I will not turn you into a monster. I'm not asking you to turn me into a monster, Grace said, forcing calm into her voice. I'm asking you to turn me into your equal, your partner, not your protected human, your queen. The word hung between them, heavy with implication. Valdimir stared at her, his expression cycling through shock, horror, and reluctant consideration. The law doesn't forbid a vampire king from having a human consort, Grace continued, pressing her advantage. It forbids it because of the perception of weakness, the vulnerability. But if I'm vampire, if I'm nobility in my own right, that argument evaporates. We'd be a united front, a vampire couple ruling together. The council couldn't argue weakness, they'd have to accept us or admit their laws are about prejudice rather than protection. In Grace, you don't understand what you're asking. Becoming vampire means giving up sunlight forever. It means drinking blood to survive. It means watching human friends and family age and die while you remain unchanged. It means becoming something other than human, something that will never fit comfortably in the mortal world again. I know, Grace said quietly. I've thought about nothing else for weeks. And yes, it terrifies me. But Valdimir, I'm already pulled between worlds. I can't go back to my ordinary life now that I know what exists in the shadows. I can't pretend I don't love you, can't imagine my life without you in it, and I don't want decades with you followed by the death that leaves you alone again. I want centuries. I want forever. You would give up your humanity for me? I would give up my mortality to spend eternity with you. There's a difference. Valdimir sank into a chair, his head in his hands. If I do this, there's no going back. The transformation is permanent, irrevocable. You would be vampire for the rest of existence. I know. You would have to learn to hunt, to control bloodlust, to navigate vampire politics and power structures. It's not a fairy tale, Grace. It's difficult and often painful and requires sacrifices you can't imagine. I know. Your family, your friends, they would have to believe you died or simply disappeared. You couldn't maintain those relationships. Not safely. That one hurt, a sharp pain in her chest. But Grace had already mourned this loss in anticipation. I know. Valdimir looked up at her, his silver eyes swimming with tears that wouldn't fall. Why? Why would you sacrifice so much? Grace knelt before him, taking his cold hands in hers, mirroring that moment 3 months ago when he'd begged her to forget. Because you're worth it. Because this love is worth it. Because I've spent 26 years playing it safe and being sensible, and I'm tired of half-lives and careful choices. I want the impossible thing. I want you, forever, in whatever form that takes. If we do this, the council cannot object. A vampire queen consort turned by the king himself, it's old tradition, actually. Royal bloodlines were often established this way in ancient times. They would have to acknowledge our union as legitimate. Then we present them with a fait accompli. You turn me, I become vampire nobility, and the council's objections become moot. You've thought this through very carefully. I'm an academic. Research is what I do. His laugh was watery, almost broken. You're certain? Truly certain, because once I begin the transformation, I cannot stop it. You would be committing to eternity with no possibility of change. Grace cupped his face in her hands, making him meet her eyes. I have never been more certain of anything. Turn me, Valdimir. Make me yours in every way possible. Let me stand beside you as your equal and your partner. Let me help you rule and protect and build whatever comes next. I choose this. I choose you. I choose us. For a long moment, he simply looked at her. Then, slowly, he nodded. Very well, but we do this properly. I will not turn you in some rushed, desperate moment. You deserve ceremony, dignity, and time to prepare. 3 days. We'll return to Prague, to Thorne Manor. You'll say your goodbyes carefully, subtly, but you'll have that closure. And then, when you're ready, I will transform you. 3 days, Grace agreed, and then forever. Those 3 days passed in a blur of preparation and emotion. Grace called her mother, inventing a story about an extended research trip to Europe that would keep her out of touch for several months. She had lunch with Zara, memorizing her friend's laugh and smile, hugging her tighter than usual at goodbye. She walked through the museum one last time in daylight, saying silent farewell to a life that had been good but never quite enough. Valdimir handled the political arrangements with ruthless efficiency. He called the Blood Council into formal session, announced his intention to take a vampire consort, and dared anyone to object to a tradition as old as their kind. The legal maneuvering was complex, but the basic truth was simple. The council had no grounds to forbid a transformation that followed ancient protocol. The night of the transformation, Grace stood in Valdimir's private chambers, a massive room dominated by a canopy bed that looked medieval, and probably was. Casimir, Seraphine, and Morgana waited as witnesses, as tradition demanded. Valdimir wore formal robes of deep crimson, and somehow that made the moment more real. "Last chance," he said softly, taking her hands. "Once I begin, you will die and be reborn as vampire. There is no reversal, no going back. Are you absolutely certain?" Grace looked into his silver eyes and saw 4,000 years of loneliness, of waiting, of hope finally realized. She saw her future reflected there, centuries of love and partnership, of adventures and challenges, of standing together against whatever came. She saw belonging in a way she'd never quite achieved in her mortal life. "I'm certain. Do it." He pulled her close, and this time his kiss was different, deeper, more urgent, tinged with the desperation of someone about to cross a forbidden line. His lips traced down her jaw to her throat, and Grace felt her pulse hammering against his mouth. "I love you," he whispered, "in this life and whatever comes after. I love you, Grace." Then he bit, and white-hot pain exploded through her veins. She'd expected it to hurt. Everything she'd read about vampire transformation mentioned the pain, but nothing had prepared her for this, for feeling like her blood had turned to fire, like every cell in her body was being simultaneously destroyed and rebuilt. Valdimir held her through it, whispering words of love and encouragement, his voice the only anchor in a sea of agony. The pain lasted hours, days, eternity. Grace lost all sense of time. She was aware of being laid on the bed, of cold cloths on her burning skin, of Valdimir's hands never leaving hers. She heard her heart slowing, faltering, stopping, felt her lungs take their last breath, and then, in the darkness and stillness of death, something stirred. Something vast and ancient and powerful, coiling in her chest where her heart had been. Her eyes snapped open. The world was different. She could see every dust mote in the air, could count the threads in the bed's canopy, could perceive colors she didn't have names for. She could hear conversations happening floors below, could smell blood flowing through veins, could feel the vibration of footsteps through stone. And she was so thirsty. "Easy." Valdimir's voice clear as crystal. He was beside her, had never left. "The hunger is overwhelming at first. I have blood prepared, fresh and human. Drink, let your body stabilize, and then we'll begin teaching you control." He helped her sit up. She moved too fast, misjudging her new strength, and suddenly she was across the room without meaning to move. Everything was too fast, too strong, too much. Panic clawed at her throat. "Breathe," Valdimir said suddenly in front of her, his hands on her shoulders. "You don't need to breathe anymore, but it helps. Concentrate. Feel your body. You're vampire now, powerful and perfect. The control will come." Grace focused on his voice, on the cool steadiness of his presence. Slowly, the panic receded. She took an experimental breath and caught 1,000 scents. Old stone, aged wood, the metallic tang of blood, Valdimir's own unique scent of winter and old books, and something indefinably him. "Good," he said, smiling. "Very good. Now, drink. You need blood to complete the transformation." He pressed a crystal glass into her hands, filled with dark red liquid that smelled like everything she'd ever wanted. Grace drank, and the taste was indescribable, rich and complex and satisfying in a way no mortal food had ever been. The terrible thirst receded, and with it, some of the overwhelming sensory input organized itself into something manageable. "How do you feel?" Valdimir asked. Grace looked down at her hands, paler now, unmarked by freckles or sun damage, preternaturally beautiful in the way all vampires were. She looked up and caught her reflection in a mirror across the room, white blonde hair, silver eyes, features refined to ethereal perfection. I feel, she searched for words. Everything. I feel everything so intensely. Is it always like this? The intensity fades as you learn control. Right now, you're experiencing existence with all your vampire senses fully awakened and no filters. It's overwhelming, but you'll adapt quickly. You're strong, Grace. Over the next few weeks, Grace learned what it meant to be vampire. Valdimir taught her to move without creating windstorms, to speak without shattering glass with volume, to manage the constant sensory input without going mad. Seraphine and Morgana became her tutors in court politics and vampire history, preparing her for the role of queen consort. The hardest lesson was learning to hunt. Valdimir took her into the city, showed her how to identify willing donors, humans who, for various reasons, offered their blood to vampires. The first time she drank directly from a human, Grace nearly lost control, the bloodlust roaring through her like wildfire. But Valdimir was there, his voice steady, guiding her through the dangerous ecstasy. "You're doing wonderfully," he told her afterward, holding her as she shook with the aftermath. "Most new vampires take months to achieve the control you've shown in weeks. You're remarkable, Grace." "I'm a monster," she whispered, tasting blood on her lips. "You're a vampire. There's a difference. We hunt, yes, but we don't have to kill. We can be predators without being murderers. I've spent centuries trying to teach our kind that distinction." "Teach me," Grace said, meeting his eyes. "Teach me how to be the kind of vampire you are, how to be powerful without being cruel, how to rule with compassion even when everything in our nature screams for domination." His smile was brilliant, proud, full of love. "That's why you'll be a perfect queen." The formal presentation to the Blood Council happened 3 months after Grace's transformation. She wore a gown of deep sapphire that had been crafted by vampire artisans, her white blonde hair arranged in elaborate braids woven with silver. She stood beside Valdimir in the council chamber, a vast circular room deep beneath Thorne Manor, surrounded by the 12 oldest vampires in existence. They were terrifying, each one radiating power and ancient authority. But Grace lifted her chin and met their collective gaze with steady confidence. She was vampire nobility now, consort to the king, and she would not show weakness. "Members of the Blood Council," Valdimir began, his voice ringing through the chamber. "I present to you Grace Thorne, my consort and queen. She has been transformed according to ancient tradition, has proven herself worthy through trials of control and learning, and claims her place at my side as is her right." The eldest council member, a vampire named Aurelius who predated even Valdimir, leaned forward. His eyes were like chips of obsidian, utterly without mercy. "The council acknowledges the transformation and the tradition invoked. However, we question the king's judgment in creating a vampire noble from human stock. What experience does this fledgling have to advise the king? What knowledge of our history, our culture, our careful balance? I know enough to recognize when laws are used as weapons rather than protections," Grace said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, or rather, the memory of a racing heart since hers no longer beat. "I know that your objection isn't about my qualifications, but about maintaining power structures that benefit the old at the expense of the new. I know that change terrifies you, because in 4,000 years of existence, the one constant has been resistance to evolution." Silence. Several council members looked genuinely shocked that she'd dare speak so directly, but Valdimir squeezed her hand, silently encouraging her to continue. "I'm not asking you to approve of me," Grace continued. "I'm telling you that I am vampire nobility, transformed by the king, which makes me your equal regardless of my age. I will learn your history and your traditions, but I will not apologize for bringing a fresh perspective. The world is changing, and vampire society must change with it or risk irrelevance. I intend to help King Valdimir guide our people into a future where we thrive rather than merely survive in the shadows." Aurelius stared at her for a long moment, then, to her shock, he laughed a dry, rustling sound like dead leaves. "Bold words from a 3-month-old vampire, but not without merit. The council accepts your status as queen consort, Grace Thorne. Prove yourself worthy of the title." The formal part of the ceremony continued with oaths and ritual, but Grace barely registered it. She'd done it. They'd won. The council had no choice but to accept what Valdimir had created, a partnership that challenged tradition, but was unassailable under their own laws. That night, in their private chambers, Valdimir pulled her into his arms and kissed her with an intensity that made the world disappear. "You were magnificent," he said against her lips. "Did you see Aurelius's face? I don't think anyone has dared speak to him so directly in a millennium. Was I too bold? I might have made enemies. You made them respect you. There's a difference." He kissed her again, deeper. "You're perfect, Grace. Everything I hoped for and more." They made love that night with the desperate intensity of two people who'd fought for the right to exist together. Grace discovered that vampire senses made every touch electric, every kiss overwhelming, every moment of connection almost unbearably intense. And when they finally lay tangled together in the darkness before dawn, she felt complete in a way she'd never experienced as human. "Tell me about forever," she whispered. "What will we do with eternity?" Valdimir traced patterns on her skin, his touch gentle. "Anything we want. We'll travel the world, experience every culture, collect art and music and stories. We'll rule together, reform vampire society from within, build alliances between our world and the human one. We'll face challenges and enemies, navigate politics and power struggles. And through it all, we'll have each other. No more loneliness, no more emptiness, just us together for as long as existence continues. I'm going to hold you to that promise. I'm counting on it." The years that followed proved challenging in ways Grace hadn't anticipated. Being Vampire Queen meant more than standing beside Valdimir at formal events. It meant real political power and real responsibility. She became involved in vampire-human relations, working to reduce the ancient tensions between species. She used her mortal background to bridge gaps that had existed for millennia, helping vampires understand human perspectives and helping humans see vampires as more than monsters. There was opposition, of course. Conservative vampires who resented her influence, who whispered that the king had been weakened by his human-turned consort. But Grace faced each challenge with the same bold confidence she'd shown the Blood Council, and slowly, grudgingly, even her enemies learned to respect her. Valdimir was beside her through all of it, her partner in every sense. They ruled together, making decisions jointly, balancing each other's strengths and weaknesses. He taught her the intricacies of vampire politics, introduced her to allies and potential threats, shared the burden of leadership that he'd carried alone for 4,000 years. And in private moments, away from court responsibilities, they were simply two people in love, learning to navigate eternity together. 5 years after her transformation, Grace stood on a balcony overlooking Prague, watching the sunset in colors she could see but no longer feel the warmth of. Valdimir appeared beside her, slipping an arm around her waist. "Regrets?" he asked quietly. Grace leaned into him, thinking about her choice. She missed sunlight sometimes, missed the simplicity of her mortal life, missed friends and family she could never see again. But when she weighed those losses against what she'd gained, this love, this partnership, this grand adventure of existence, the balance fell clearly to one side. "None," she said honestly. "This life is harder than I imagined, more complicated and challenging and sometimes painful. But it's also more beautiful, more meaningful, more full. I wouldn't trade it for anything." "I love you," Valdimir said, the words still carrying the same weight they had that first time. "Every day of these 5 years, I've fallen deeper in love with you. Every day I'm grateful you overheard my whispered confession, that you were brave enough to confront me instead of running, that you chose this impossible thing we've built together." Grace turned in his arms, looking up at the Vampire King who'd knelt before her and begged her to forget him. "I'm glad I didn't forget. I'm glad I fought for us, and I'm grateful for every day of forever we have ahead." He kissed her as the sun finished setting, as the stars emerged in the darkening sky, as the world transformed from day to night. Around them, Prague came alive with evening lights, humans and vampires beginning their respective nights, two worlds existing side by side. In the distance, church bells tolled the hour. Traffic sounds drifted up from the streets below. The world continued its ancient dance, unaware that on a balcony high above, a vampire king and his queen held each other and contemplated eternity. "Come," Valdimir said eventually, pulling her back inside. "The French ambassador is arriving tonight for trade negotiations. We should prepare. Politics never sleep, do they? Not when you're king, though I promise, after the negotiations conclude, I'm declaring a holiday. 3 days, just us, somewhere without responsibility or duty. Perhaps Greece? You haven't seen Athens yet. I've never seen Athens, but you knew it when it was the center of the world. Then let me show you through both sets of eyes the ancient city I remember and the modern one that exists now. We'll weave past and present together." They walked through Thorne Manor hand in hand, partners in every sense, ready to face whatever the night brought. They'd fought for this, for the right to exist together, for the freedom to love across impossible boundaries, for a future neither had imagined possible. Grace sometimes thought about that night 3 months into their courtship, when Valdimir had knelt before her and begged her to forget. He'd been so certain that loving him would only bring her pain, so determined to protect her even from himself. He couldn't have known that she would choose transformation, that she would become not his protected human, but his equal, his partner, his queen. But that was the thing about love, Grace had learned. It wasn't about protection or safety or keeping each other in comfortable boxes. It was about choosing each other despite the risks, about building something together that was stronger than either person alone. It was about being brave enough to fight for impossible things. They entered the reception hall where the French ambassador waited, and Grace lifted her chin, stepping into her role as queen consort with practiced grace. Beside her, Valdimir radiated authority and power, the vampire king in all his ancient glory. But when he glanced at her, his silver eyes softened with love, and she saw not the terrifying immortal ruler, but the man who'd whispered desperate confessions in shadowed corridors, who'd knelt before her in vulnerability, who'd given her the choice even when it terrified him. She saw her partner, her love, her forever. And as they greeted the ambassador and began the intricate dance of vampire politics, Grace felt a deep satisfaction settle in her chest. This was her life now, complex and challenging and sometimes dangerous, but rich with meaning and purpose and love. She'd traded mortality for eternity, sunlight for starlight, ordinary life for extraordinary adventure. It was, without question, the best decision she'd ever made. Years became decades, and decades flowed into centuries with the strange fluidity of vampire existence. Grace learned to measure time not in days but in eras, in the rise and fall of human movements and technological revolutions. She watched the world transform around her, the internet explosion, climate change, social upheavals, and worked alongside Valdimir to keep vampire society adapting, evolving, surviving. They traveled constantly, maintaining their network of alliances across the globe. They spent a decade in Tokyo, another in Buenos Aires, returned regularly to Prague and New York. Grace never stopped learning, never stopped growing into her role. She became known in vampire circles as the Bridge Queen, the one who could speak to both worlds, who'd never forgotten her human perspective even as she embraced vampire existence. Through it all, the love between them deepened. Not the frantic passion of new romance, though, that flared regularly, but something more solid, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and genuine understanding. They argued occasionally, usually about policy or approach, but they always worked through it. They'd learned to communicate across the gaps in their experience, to value each other's perspectives even when they disagreed. On their 100th anniversary, a century since Grace's transformation, Valdimir took her back to the east corridor of Thorne Manor, to the shadowed alcove where she'd once hidden and overheard his whispered confession. "Do you remember this place?" he asked. "Of course. This is where everything changed." He pulled her into the alcove until they stood exactly where she'd stood that night so long ago. "I was right here," he said, pointing to a spot a few feet away, speaking to Casimir, pouring out my heart about a human woman I'd only just met, certain I was doing the noble thing by letting you go. I was so sure that loving me could only hurt you." "You couldn't have known," Grace said softly. But I should have trusted you with the choice. I should have believed in your strength, in your ability to decide for yourself what risks were worth taking. Instead, I assumed I knew better, that I needed to protect you from your own decisions." He cupped her face in his hands. "You taught me something crucial that night when you confronted me. You taught me that love isn't about control or protection, it's about partnership, about trusting your partner to know their own mind and make their own choices." "We were both learning," Grace said. "I was naive about what choosing you would mean, about how hard vampire existence could be. But I wasn't wrong about us being worth it." "No," Valdimir agreed. "You weren't wrong at all." They kissed in that shadowed alcove, 100 years falling away until they were simply two people finding each other again. Around them, Thorne Manor hummed with activity. It had become not just a residence but a cultural center, a place where vampires and select humans could meet and exchange ideas. The world they'd dreamed of building, where species coexisted with mutual respect rather than fear, was slowly becoming reality. It would take more centuries, probably millennia, to fully realize that vision. But Grace had learned patience along with power. She had eternity to work toward a better world, and she had Valdimir beside her every step of the way. As they left the alcove and returned to the reception hall where a celebration awaited them, Grace reflected on the strange path her life had taken. From small-town Oregon to international art historian to vampire queen, it wasn't a journey anyone could have predicted. But it was hers, chosen and fought for, and deeply, completely right. She'd overheard a Vampire King's whispered confession, and instead of running from the danger and impossibility, she'd run toward it. She'd confronted him when he tried to push her away for her own good. She'd insisted on partnership over protection, on facing challenges together rather than apart. And in doing so, she'd found something most people, human or vampire, spent entire lifetimes seeking. She'd found home, in a person, in a partnership, in a love that transcended species and mortality and every reasonable limitation. Valdimir took her hand as they entered the celebration, and Grace squeezed back, a silent communication that needed no words. Whatever came next, whatever challenges or joys or adventures eternity held, they would face it together. Because she'd loved a vampire king, and he'd knelt before her in vulnerable desperation, and she'd chosen him anyway. Chosen both of them, chosen the impossible future they could build together. And that choice had made all the difference.